Greetings, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Doug Rogers. I'm the faculty director of the program in Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Yale University. Also an affiliate of the European Studies Council at the Macmillan Centre. It is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you to this most unusual and eclectic of book launches for a most unusual and eclectic and wonderful book. Let me congratulate the editors and the authors, many of whom are gathered here on the completion of such a wonderful project. You know, I think over the past year, all of us have gotten used to that moment where you think, well, that really didn't work over Zoom, or well, that really did. Maybe Zoom was really the right genre for that. True to their own originality and their vision for this project and so much else, Jonathan and Michal have put together a book launch that is well suited to this project and is well suited to this format. I can't recall ever being at a book launch that has so many of the actual authors in an edited collection ready to speak, with commentators, with participants from around the world. The possibilities that this format allows for engaging with the very topics of the book of recentering and decentering and recomposing and decomposing and thinking across space in creative ways are enabled not just by Zoom, but by the enormously creative and careful way that Jonathan and Michal have put together this book launch. So it's a real privilege and an honor to host. I say that as the unit that has had perhaps the smallest possible contribution to this enormous project, which is we are hosting the webinar, and delighted to do so by virtue of Jonathan's affiliation with the Macmillan Centre. But this is really a project that emerges from an enormous collaboration over many years in which other institutions have played a leading and enormous role in seeing it through from initial conference panels through all sorts of iterations to the final book and now the book launch. So it is an honor, but I will get out of the way and allow those who have had much more role in seeing this project from its earliest stages to its fruition now to speak further. So let me hand things over to Diane Conquer. Diane.
Thanks, Doug. On behalf of the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, I'm delighted to share in the welcome of those who are attending this book launch for the book Recentering the City, Global Mutations of Socialist Modernity. And thanks very much to our friends at Yale for organizing this webinar and all the participants for coming along. I'm Diane Conquer. I'm the director of SSEES. And SSEES was, before I became director, was actually the host of the conference that got this started. SSEES has been devoted to the interdisciplinary study of the Slavonic and East European region for over 100 years. And this book demonstrates the tremendous intellectual purchase of bringing the disciplines into conversation with one another. More recently, our scholars have been increasingly challenging the formal geographic borders of our region, drawing attention to systems and processes that knowledge of the region helps to conceptualize, but does not limit. And the book, I think, is a good example of that kind of activity. The FRINGE Centre, which is located within SSEES and the UCL Institute for Advanced Study, has been one of the active centers of inquiry into area studies without borders, along with projects that look at the global East, or second world, third world interactions, or the common problems of emerging economies, all of which are increasingly central to our activities at SSEES. So this book is very much in the tradition of what we do and what we're becoming as an institution. So I look forward to a lively presentation and a discussion of this important new book.
Thank you. I'll just follow on from Diane. I'm Ian Scott, the director of UCL's Grand Challenges program. It's part of the Office of the Vice Provost of Research, where we operationalize the university's research strategy. It's a great privilege to be in on this webinar today with Yale University, one of UCL's strategic partners. And just wanted to note that the book was provided with some support, forgive me, a dog barking outside there, by the Grand Challenges program through a small grant to Jane Rendell of the Bartlett School of Architecture and Michal in SSEES just a few years ago. So a little bit of a stimulus to support their transcentric urbanism project at the time. Yeah, I mean, I'm just grateful that Grand Challenges has had an opportunity to stimulate this work and help towards the outcome of a UCL Press imprint. UCL Press is great. We've got 185 monographs produced so far through UCL Press, which have resulted in 4 million downloads across the world, across 220 jurisdictions. So it's a great way, I think, for scholars in the arts and humanities to get real penetrance with their work. And I wish Michal and Jonathan and all their contributors to this edited volume every success.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ian and Doug and Diane, for those thoughts and for the support, obviously, from Grand Challenges and from SSEES, and for hosting us here at Yale for the launch. I suppose I will just get started now. I'll share the screen for the sort of round robin section of our intro. Jonathan and I are going to introduce the themes of the book briefly as we sort of our framing for the book, and then we'll hand over to the authors, starting with Vladimir, chapter by chapter, for their short, very brutally short presentations of their chapters. So I'm just going to share my screen as long as the technology allows me to do so. I think I have to make it full screen before I share it, don't I? And I'll start talking. Can everybody see this, the screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Natalia. Okay, so I think it's fair to say, and this is kind of one of the points of departure of this book, that we are still obsessed with the monuments and palaces, and hopefully also with socialism, although there is less evidence of that. White anti-vaxxers in First Nations outfits have stormed the Capitol, and a film about $1 billion palace for Putin led to Russia's biggest street protests in a decade. My thoughts on the framing of our book sit very much within the eternal question all devoted readers of Vladimir Papierny ask themselves. Are there only two architectural cultures, culture one and culture two? Or is there a third space or a third culture out there somewhere too? Is there such a thing as culture three? This book has no answer to that question. However, what we do suggest in our introduction is that in a sense, the world is currently stuck within two parallel modes of political aesthetic false consciousness. One is called culture tree, not culture three. This is the culture of normalized greenwashing, monstrous resource depletion manifesting as sustainability and ecology. Perhaps the most egregious example of this is Moshe Safdie's motorcycle Jewel in the new terminal at Singapore's airport on the left, or actually even worse, global carbon chugger-in-chief and plague profiteer Amazon's recently announced perverted eco-Tatlin Tower in Virginia. The other is called culture free rather than culture tree. This is the culture of hyper-centralization and power vertical, cosplaying as the culture of decentering and horizontality. Culture free, in other words, is the culture of the fake horizontal. This is the culture of the pyramid scheme and of MMM Bank, of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, arguably. It's the culture of bullshit inclusivity that pervades all of our lives, especially our pyramidal institutions, and which I think has gone into overdrive since the eruption into our lives of COVID, still so often described in public discourse, remarkably still often described as the great leveler. PPV's summer project, Piramida, which the kind of animation for here is shown, is devoted to, which is in many ways an offshoot of the present volume, was devoted precisely to exposing and analyzing the many shapes and styles of this pyramidal culture free. So culture tree and culture free are intimately related and intersected, and together I'm suggesting that they comprise the twin poles of the kind of hegemonic archicultural false consciousness of the global post-socialist, or rather the zombie socialist world. And I'm just going to show very briefly this clip. I hope you'll be able to hear the sound. It's a 30-second clip to show just how depressing the zombie socialist political aesthetic predicament is. This is a promotional video for another great COVID beneficiary, Decentraland, a newly launched in 2020 virtual blockchain world, complete with retrogressive late 1990s aesthetics, which markets itself as the first, quote, the first ever community created and governed by its users, and where plots of land closest to the center of town, Center Genesis Plaza in Decentraland, fetch the highest prices up to several $100,000. Hopefully this will work.
What if you could own the virtual world? Create, develop, and trade without limits. Make genuine connections and earn real money. Decentraland, a fully immersive platform powered by the blockchain. Buy land. Design your experience. And transform the way people see the world. Purchase the first ever virtual real estate. Get started today.
And it's possibly symptomatic that by the time of their launch this year, Decentraland had introduced a mild mutation of their logo from a mountain scene to a pyramid scape. So in any case, that's it for me. Over to Jonathan now.
Hello, hello. I don't have a slideshow, so maybe we could just go back to just the speaking image there. You can stop sharing your screen, Michal. Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you and welcome. I'm Jonathan Bach. I'm a professor of global studies at the New School in New York City. And I want to welcome everyone from time zones far and wide to our pandemic-delayed launch of our co-edited volume, Recentering the City. Michal has just evocatively laid out one of the main themes of the book. While decentering can be an attractive and seductive counterpoint to a powerful center, it is to be enjoyed with caution. These days, it is increasingly clear how the advantages of decentering technologies, such as our own distributed and dispersed gathering today, also can strengthen the centripetal tendency of platform monopolies such as Zoom and Facebook, and even wider forms of datification. In other words, decentralization and centralization of power are not necessarily opposites, but can complement each other in unpredictable ways. This is one of the conundrums that the volume explores through the lens of the built environment of the city. The city is a metaphor written in stone and streets. It is subject to continuous appropriation. What, this volume asks, are its politics of centrality? Are there counterforms of centrality that are not also forms of decentering in the way that Michal just explained? How can we bring historical specificity to bear on understanding this tension between de and recentering, and how this tension reshapes the fabric of the urban? What role does monumental architecture, so beloved by the former US president, or the fear of protests in city centers, often boarded up in fear, play in organizing and reorganizing center and periphery? What do these terms even mean anymore? In our own gesture towards decentering and recentering, and transcending both of those, our volume starts from socialist modernity, specifically from Moscow, and its great decentering as the center of state socialism. The essays in the volume then fan out across the globe. The essays ground, often literally in concrete, the abstract questions I just mentioned above, as they explore formations of centering, centrism, uncentering, anti-centering, and decentering across an expanded notion of the East, a notion of East that is de-anchored from a specifically geographical space and which fits uncomfortably with any notion of post. Along the way, we find ourselves stumbling towards new vocabularies for thinking socialist modernity and urban modernity, and the relation of urban form to ideology more broadly. I don't need to give you an overview of the chapters because luckily we are honored to have here almost all of the authors who will next give you a very brief taste of what lies therein. And thanks to the good graces of the oxymoronically on purpose named FRINGE Centre at UCL, you can download the entire book for free from UCL Press. Though I would hasten to add, the hard copy with its color plates is awfully nice and worth the price. Before we turn to the authors and a brief overview of the rest of the event, I'd like to give a brief overview of the rest of the event and a word of thanks. Following the authors' round robin, we are deeply honored to have 4 extraordinary urbanists who will say a word or two on the presentations and the book. Keller Easterling, the Enid Dwyer Professor of Architecture and Director of the MED program at Yale. Kimberly Zarecor, Professor of Architecture in the College of Design at Iowa State University. Solomon Benjamin, Associate Professor in Humanities and Social Science at the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. And Jennifer Robinson, Professor of Geography at University College London. After they speak, we will open up the question and answers. And due to the large audience, we will take concisely written questions submitted through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button, not the chat, to answer the questions. We may not see what's in the chat, and so if you ask your question there, it may disappear into the ether or only be seen after the fact. So please use the Q&A button. Of course, you can write a question at any time during the presentations. You don't have to wait until the end to pose the question, but we'll certainly wait until Q&A to start answering them. Before I turn back to Michal and the authors, allow me to say how grateful we are to the FRINGE Centre and the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at UCL, especially Diane Conker, Alina Ledineva, Peter Zusi, Ian Scott, and Chris Penfold at the UCL Press, as well as Lisa Walters at SSEES, Albert Brenchad Aguiar at IAS, and Evie Kaldar at Grand Challenges. We also thank, of course, our hosts at Yale, the European Studies Council, and the Russia and East European and Eurasian Studies program, especially their respective directors, Julia Adams and Doug Rogers, and the essential staff members, Christina Andriotis, Asia Neupan, and Kathleen Keith. I also want to mention Calvert 22 Gallery, where this all started as a wonderful, raucous, overwhelming presentation in the gallery as part of their Power and Architecture series in the days directly before Brexit, those halcyon days. I would also like to thank my own program, the Global Studies program at the New School, and most of all, I'd like to thank Erin Simmons, whose superhuman efforts at the final stages of the volume brought it all together in the form that you see now. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Michal, who will start the round robin, and here we go.
This is the slideshow will show the titles of the chapters and the titles of the sections. Some of the authors have slides, some of them don't. So I might share and unshare the screen depending on whether the author has a slide. So our first, we're running in the order of our table of contents, and our first author will start the book with no less than Vladimir Popiadny, who's joining us all the way from California today. So Vladimir, over to you.
Thank you, Michal. When excuse me, when Michal invited me to participate with this project, I asked him, I said, I want to do something very unorthodox. I want to talk about my personal history and my family history. And Michal was, I would say, adventurous enough, or should I say reckless enough, to allow me. And so I did. And while doing this, I realized that all my interest in research and academic studies was related to my interest in the family history. because I just realized there was a very deep and strong connection between personal and cultural and historical. And this is what I've written. And one thing I want to add is writing this chapter had a very profound influence on me. I ended up writing a novel on the same subject, and it was just recently published in Russian under the title of Schulze's Archive, or Archiv Schulze in Russian. And of course, it's a story of a fictitious family with, of course, some connection to the real family. So I must say that this participation influenced me in a very serious way. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vladimir, and I can't wait to read the book as soon as the postal service starts being able to send it over from Russia to the UK, which will, God knows when that will happen. But it's an honor to have you in the book and to have sparked a bigger project. And we now move on to Clementine Settle with her chapter called Fortress City: The Hegemony of the Moscow Kremlin. Thanks, Michal, and thank you for absolutely dragging this essay out of me for the book. I'm really proud to be part of it. So could we have the slide, please? In these two maps, on the left, we have a historic map from 200 years ago, and then a contemporary map showing the street plan. And my essay is really an exploration about how the Kremlin occupies the center of Moscow and the excessive influence that it has, therefore, on the planning of the city, and how that, I mean, Moscow, got 10 more seconds. I'll just say that you can see very clearly from these maps how Moscow occupies the center of the hierarchy in the Kremlin in Moscow, and hierarchy is very important in Russian culture. And the essay explores the distortions and the paradoxes that lead from this excessive influence, and also look at what the Kremlin manifests in terms of ideas and how those ideas affect what is built and what's destroyed around it. Thank you. Thanks, Clem. And you also have a book coming out soon, don't you, about Moscow? Or is that a secret? No, it's not. It's a book about an early a building from the period of this map, actually, of this map, an early pre-fire wooden building. It's exploring its history. Cool, thank you. So Andreas Schönle is with us as well. His chapter is called Appropriating Stalinist Heritage, State Rhetoric and Urban Transformation in the Repurposing of VDNH.
Thanks, Michal. So VDNH is the exhibition of the achievements of the national economy. It's a huge exhibition site. Initially, it was on the outskirts of Moscow. Of course, now it's been grown around very much. It's about the size of the city of London, has very complicated histories, opened in 1939 and has acquired different architectural layers over its history. In the 90s, it was privatized, a decade into commercial space for petty trade overseen by mafia groups. And then in 2014, the city of Moscow gained control over it and embarked on an energetic repurposing, which is the subject of the chapter. And one of the main issues here is what to do with the pompous, Stalinist architecture that's prominently featured on this site, and all the Soviet propaganda claptrap that comes with it. This reconstruction was presented at the Venice Biennale in 2016. And there, the curator of the Russian pavilion, a certain Semyon Mikhailovsky, talks about decontamination of the buildings. The idea is to bring about a complete divorce between form and function, so that you can use grand architecture as a kind of a glorious aestheticized shell into which you can inject whatever you like. And that brings us to our picture here. On the left, you've got the central pavilion, which is the first one you see when you arrive on the site. And then on the right, you have the map of the exhibition, the park, stylized as a computer motherboard. So that was part of the exhibit in Venice. That is the underlying circuitry before you even install the operating system. So that is pure potentiality without any content. And that's the way they pretend to treat the exhibition. Of course, you don't need me to tell you that it's not that simple, right? And in fact, the park management has approached the site as a kind of a top-down initiative whose ultimate aim is social engineering, and Stalinist architecture is used to great effect. But I really can't talk about this in 1 minute. I probably have already talked 2 minutes, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Andreas. There was a lot of content in a very short time. Oops. That's the alarm clock that I'm failing to set for people at the end of their time slot. So the next chapter is by Owen Hatherley, The City, Chapter 4, The City Without a Centre, Urbanism and Communism Revisited. Owen, over to you.
Hello. So yes, this is a picture taken somewhere vaguely on the railway between Kazan and Yekaterinburg, and is intended to illustrate the question of disurbanism, and knowing that a lot of the kind of topics of the conference and the book would be very connected to a sort of giant, bombastic, centrist kind of architecture of the Stalin era, I wanted to kind of concentrate on its most sort of radical alternative, or kind of sort of preemption in a way, which was the disurbanism propagated by the sociologist and planner Michal at the end of the 20s and start of the 30s, which basically argued for the sort of total decentering of the entirety of Russia, and it's spreading out across a sort of gigantic infrastructural network of endless prefabricated houses and strips of industry, with cities essentially dissolved, and in so doing, realizing the dissolution between town and country prophesied in Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. So Orchitovich is something of a kind of martyr for those who are kind of, you know, interested in constructivism and the avant-garde. He had been a Trotskyist. He was sent to the Gulag and was shot. And I kind of wanted to kind of do two things. One of which was to see whether or not there was anything genuinely kind of realistic in the proposal. The spoiler here is no, but also whether or not, and seen in the long run, this was a proposal which did in some way find fruition as a result of the enormous programs of second home ownership that came particularly after the Second World War, and particularly after 1956, when the Soviet Union had for a time, I think, the highest second home ownership in the world. And these kind of little prefabricated dachas, usually strung out along railways or strung out along main roads, seen as a sort of accidental, inadvertent, possible fulfillment of Orchitovich's idea of decentered communism. What did I do for time? I'm done.
We're done. Okay, great. Thank you. That was a very Deserbanist presentation. So moving on to Dasha Paramonova, who I think may not be here because she said she had some childcare crises. So in case Dasha is here, let us know. But if not, her chapter is called Mutant Centralities, Moscow Architecture in the Post-Soviet Era. And Dasha's chapter is a kind of insider's tale of the transformation of the makeover of Moscow over the past few years. A kind of a distant insider's tale, you could say. So we'll move on to part 2, titled Off-Center Palatial Periphery. So we're kind of decentering ourselves from the Moscow cosmos. And the first chapter in this section is Jonathan Bach's chapter 6, Berlin's Empty Center, a Double Take.
Thank you, Michal. Yes, leaving Moscow, my chapter explores via Berlin between 1950 and 1973, the enigma of the center when it is unbuilt, and in this form becomes a site of anticipation, projection, and ambiguity. Most discussions of Berlin's post-war center today mention only its buildings, the Imperial Castle, the Palace of the Republic, and the current Humboldt Forum, but gloss over how, after the Imperial Castle was blown up in 1950 by the new GDR, the site stood unbuilt for 23 post-war years, nearly as long as it was built. This situation has its analogy, of course, after the closure of the Palace of the Republic in 1990. But back in the early Cold War, the GDR faced a conundrum about the absent imperial space at its center, a torso without a head, to borrow Bruno Taut's phrase. After failed attempts to import the Moscow model with a Berlin version of Red Square and a monumental central building, the very symbol of centrality shifted ever so slightly further east, and the never-built socialist tall building was effectively displaced by the now famous television tower, a new visual center for a new centrality of the visual, which left what later became the low-rise Palace of the Republic in its shadow. So looking back today at this period when the site remained unbuilt allows us to theorize the constant reappropriation of the center as an ongoing site of the future anterior. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And the next chapter is Kadisha von Zinenberg Carroll and Jonas Tinius's co-written piece, Phantom Palaces, Prussian Centralities and Humboldtian Spectres. But they, in fact, have a kind of rejigged presentation, which I've, of course, failed to embed into the PowerPoint as promised. So I'm going to reshare the video. But in the meantime, maybe Jonas and Kadisha, you want to contextualize your clip a bit.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you for putting this together. Our chapter is a take on, as it were, the zombie return of Prussia's colonial and cultural heritage in Berlin's former East, where a former socialist palace of doubt, this one here, made way for the return of a new ethnological universalism. Khadija, do you want to add something?
Kadisha's disappeared.
I think the sound has disappeared. So in the absence of sound, maybe we'll just say that we've also taken a bit of a take on a more recent battle of words and quotes that was launched on International Women's Day by one of its former male directors, and you'll see what our take is on this.
Okay, so shall I share the screen and play the video?
Yes, go ahead.
Let me see if this works.
The Palace of Doubt.
Or a 1-minute reenactment of white male fragility.
An antagonism of quotes.
Or the Karate Kick versus guilt religion. Some 20 years ago, a few wise white men from the West decided to rebuild their fairy tale castle.
But they had forgotten the revenge of the colonial past.
AKA the Humboldt Forum. AKA Lootfortrum. This is a film featuring
King Hermann, president of the German Cultural Heritage Foundation, or the Black Belt of Dahlem, and his quest for the Siberian Golden Grail. In the film, says things like, in judo, you can't be passive too long, but I'm not powerful enough. So I go along with my opponent until the decisive moment, and then I strike him back.
Also featuring Horst Bredekamp, Enlightenment, old man, founding director, seeking justice for the Palace of Loot against the clan of Poco.
Also featuring Nanette Snoop, or Kill Will 2, putting the big boys back on the couch, saying things like, it appears as if the debate about ethnological museums is about imperial male fragility. Thank you. For more context, read the chapter.
To add about the recent developments with the Humboldt's declaration of regarding the Benin bronzes. We'll save that for later.
We'll save that for later.
We'll save that for later. Okay. All right. Let me reshare my presentation. The next chapter, let's see who the next chapter is by. Oh, it's by me. Okay. So I won't talk. My chapter is called Palatial Socialism or Still Socialist Centrality in Warsaw. And this is effectively a short story about the Stalinist architectural ideologue Edmund Goldsamt, who, in direct contradiction to the title of Owen's chapter, argued that there is no such thing as a city without a center. And my argument is in part of a defense of the idea that I think there is sort of such a thing as a socialist palatiality. And I also try to show that Goldsamt's thinking and writing about socialist urbanism and socialist centrality directly prefigured and was much more interesting than Henri Lefebvre's ideas about socialist, about centrality formulated a decade or so later. So that's it from part 2. And we move on to part 3, looking inward, recentering the sacred. The first contribution to this section is by Kuba Snopek, Karolina Popera, and Iza Cichońska. I don't think Kuba's been able to join us today. So I'll just read out the title of his chapter, The Architecture of the Seventh Day, Building the Sacred and Socialist Poland. And it's worth checking out the associated website and buying the book as well, because it's a very interesting project. And the next chapter is by Natalia Romik, who is here, entitled Post-Shtetl, Spectral Transformation and Architectural Challenges in the Periphery's Bloodstream. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you, Michal, and maybe we can have a picture. Oh, yes. 3 years ago, when I was writing an article for recentering the city, my mind was entirely fixed on shtetl, small post-Jewish town, very often economically and socially poor, and urban evidence to the inequalities between metropolitan centers and the peripheries. So the article was focused on nomadic shtetl archive, mirror cloud vehicles storing archival materials on the Jewish past of the small towns we visit. But my travels with the archive have not focused entirely on Jewish matters. I have analyzed problems with failed revitalization, wild privatization, and urban politics of the post-Jewish properties that neither used or demolished slowly crumble to dust. The Mirror Cloud Archive was my helper. In Hebrew, you say shamesh, a performative mapping tool, helper. Today, some of the towns I wrote about have declared themselves as LGBT ideology-free zones, unfortunately. This is my hypothesis that unprocessed historical traumas related to the Holocaust results as a political obscurantism and also intolerance. This is an image that you can see from my current investigation research, where I have need to make a bit of digging to the research of the architecture of hiding places where Jews were hiding during the Second World War. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. And I highly recommend a new documentary that just came out about Natalia's new project on Arte TV, in which the camera follows Natalia looking into the, digging deep into the sort of Jewish hiding places that are still existing all over Poland. The next chapter is by Jennifer Mack, who I think isn't able to join us today. She might join a bit later, but the title of her chapter is Eat, Pray, Shop, the Mosque as Centrum in Swedish Suburbs. And we move on to part 4, Looking Upward, Power Verticals. The first chapter is by Steve Graham, Verticality and Centrality, the Politics of Contemporary Skyscrapers. Steve has a prior engagement at the moment, so he's not able to join us. And the same is true for Vijayanti Rao, her chapter is titled Partitioning Earth and Sky, Vertical Urbanism in Post-Socialist Mumbai, in which she makes very convincingly the argument that, at least from the point of view of verticality, Mumbai can be considered a post-socialist city. And the next chapter is by Tom Wolseley, titled Vertical Horizons of the Shadow of the Shard. So Tom, over to you.
Yes, hello, am I visible? Yeah, I'll just carry on, shall I? Is that working?
Yes.
First of all, thanks to Michal and Jonathan and everyone for organizing this event and the many that preceded it. I would like to emphasize one quality of my film about the Shard today, shardbivalence. This is a term my collaborator Andrew Harris and I developed to resist an imperative we felt while negotiating such a monolithic object towards an equally identified and polemical response. We resolutely tried in the structure of the film and our research to inhabit the complexity of this object, to hold on to a complex relational mode of interaction with an object that seems to invite and indeed capitalize on aspirations of autonomy and power that belie its actual complexity and vulnerability. I am keen to value the spectacle of monolithic identification as a cultural strategy, an architectural trope of institutionalizing values in our larger imaginary. To deny this as part of our repertoire of cultural construction is to succumb to the vertical horizons of the polemic, to fall into the absolutism that these objects appear to invite. The challenge is to develop new creative strategies that accommodate the variety of emergent forms, not to resort to becoming vertical or horizontalist, to remain shardbivalent to the simplification of complex events. Thank you.
Thomas, I only switched to your second slide at the very end. Before I pass over to Pushpa, I just wanted to mention to the panelists that actually I think the panelists can't ask questions in the Q&A for some reason. So if a panelist has a question, you can just type it directly into the chat to panelists and attendees. That's probably the easiest way. Or ask it verbally when the time comes. So part 5 is called Looking Outward, Hinterlands, Diffusions, Explosions. And the first chapter in this section is by Pushpa Arabindu, New Geographies of Hinterland. Pushpa, over to you.
Great, thank you, Michal. What I ask in this chapter is, should peripheries continue to be pitted in a dialectical relationship with the centrality of the city, or should we be thinking about its conceptualization to open up new perspectives on the urban? I explore new geographies of hinterland in the southern Indian city of Chennai, not as simply what lies beyond the urban, but one that involves an assortment of morphological forms, settlement typologies, including the urban, the suburban, the peri-urban, the rural, and even the wilderness. It calls for a strategic shift to a focus on the land question as an intrinsic aspect of the urban question. And yet, when you subject the operational landscape of this new hinterland to an empirical scrutiny, as I have done in the city of Chennai, you find that this nascent form of bypass urbanism is based on a megalogistical collective that hints at a spatiotemporal incongruence that I'm still exploring. I started work on this a few years ago, and it's constantly evolving, and I still continue to unpack some of the complexities that keep changing on almost a daily basis. And I have to say that when Michal sent the template of the slides, I was quite struck by the fuchsia pink background with the yellow combination. And I can see that it's carefully coordinated with his wardrobe and his shirt today. Well done, Michal. Thank you.
No one was supposed to notice that. Thanks a lot, Pushpa. That's great. Okay, Patrick Neveling is next. Potentially the longest title in the book, De-escalating the Centre, Urban Futures and Special Economic Zones Beyond Post-Structuralism's Neoliberal Imaginations. I think Natalia's was almost as long, actually. So, Patrick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me here. And to be honest, title is very long. I wrote the chapter in 2016, so I have no idea what it is about actually, but I've tried to make up something, which is here the image of Shenzhen in the middle, kind of laid off Mauritian ex-special economic zone worker on her weaving machine at home, and an abandoned special economic zone in Cyprus. And special economic zones are, since some time, the hottest currency in neoliberal development economics. 5,400 zones, more than 100 million workers, roughly 147 nations. And the point that I'm making in the chapter, I believe, is that there's something that post-structuralist social sciences and the World Bank and other neoliberal development economists have in mind. Namely, that they constantly say that, oh, there's this new center, this is how the future will be. Whereas if with Walter Benjamin, we look in the present, we see that actually 99% of those 5,400 zones are not like Shenzhen. They are very mundane, horrible places that are dull, boring, backward, and so on. And so this is an exercise in kind of, let's say, empowerment, in the sense that we are not overwhelmed by a possible future, but that with Walter Benjamin, and I read one sentence and then I'm done, we are kind of looking at the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception, but the rule. Yeah, and that's how we can end capitalism, hopefully.
That's very optimistic and hopeful. At least we've ended the term, and you know that's pretty close. So next chapter is by Joy Gerard, Explosion, Response, Aftermath.
Oh, hi everybody, and thank you, Michal. My essay in the book, it talks about explosive events in the city space and what comes after these volatile occurrences. So I tried to think about the shock of Brexit and the Trump election and how these events enveloped us and denied us agency in different ways. I think about aftermath and how the post-event conditions make resistance and protest both potent and powerful. And of course, I'm an artist, so within the essay, I consider how my working and painting methods reflect the volatility of the crowd, and conversely, the permanence of the architectural site in which it gathers. Finally, I write about the actual physical process of making the paintings and how I seek a translation from the scopic moment of the original photograph. I've chosen this particular image because it's about both verticality and horizontality. This is a protest against Brexit that took place in central London in mid-2018. And in it, the crowd pulls in different ways and the buildings float and appear unstable. Michal and Jonathan speak beautifully in the introduction about power, but also about how the shape of the built environment is harder to change with elections and revolutions, and instead new forms of power appropriate the centre in new ways. So of course, I showed this actual work about 2 years ago, and of course, everything has transformed and changed and imploded since then. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. That's great. And that's the end of part 5. So we move on to part 6, Things Fall, Afterlives of Monumentality. And the first chapter is by Adam Kassa, Domestic Monumentality, Scales of Relationship in the Modern City. Over to you, Adam. I hope I've done
thanks so much
with the slides.
Great. So domestic monumentality ends with the inauguration of Tlatelolco on the 20th of November, 1964, a project of the Mexican architect Mario Pani in Mexico City. And it focuses on documents from Pani's urban studio in the 1950s. It's monumental because of the terraforming and restructuring of urban space to create, in just over a decade, housing for some 100,000 state workers and families. It's domestic because the monumental begins here with a reorganization of interiors and of the imagination of the family. The chapter is particularly interested in the organization of the scales of relation between the domestic and the monumental. Here, the living room is the house, is the unit, is the neighborhood, is the zone of the city, is the city itself, not simply because they appear side by side in the same architectural publications or documents, but because they're represented through the same visual logic, the image you see in the center, these shifting scalar relations. The chapter suggests that to these urban researchers and architects at the time, the city was made to appear at certain intelligible scales. So the question of what the city looks like between scales becomes a design impossibility, but also a potential political opening. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Thanks very much, Adam. And Alexei Radinsky, who I think was here earlier on. Yes, you're there. Amazing. Really glad you could make it. So Alexei's chapter is called On an Alleged Thought of Inflicting Harm on a Lenin Statue.
Hi, thank you, Michal, for making me write this and to be here. And yeah, so to this publication, I contributed a really short essay on counter-revolutionary and colonial violence perpetrated in Crimea at the moment by the Russian forces, and the way they weaponize historical memory in the urban space. And this is all based on the case of the Crimean prisoners, the case of Felix Sentsov and Sasha Kolchenko, who had incredibly luckily been released out of Russian jail since, in the meantime, since the writing of the text. And yeah, my essay is also really short, so I feel like my speech could even be shorter than 1 minute. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexei. Thanks for dropping by. And I think your chapter was the penultimate one. The last chapter is by Yevgenia Belarusets, titled "We're Losing Him on Monuments to Demolition and the Cult of Demolition." On monuments to Lenin, I think, actually. Sorry, I must have I miswrote that. On monuments to Lenin and the cult of demolition in present-day Ukraine. And Yevgenia, I saw you there. Did you want to make a small statement? I think Yevgenia told me she might have to leave early, so possibly she's already left. But it's an extraordinary chapter of the story of the different bits of the Lenin statue and of the particular Lenin statue and what happened to them after its demolition. So that brings us to the end of our high octane round robin kind of 1 minute MTV generation presentation, and we're actually ahead of time, so we're 3 minutes ahead of time. But I think it's high time to move on to the respondents, the respondents that we're lucky enough to have with us today. Jonathan, am I handing over to you for chairing this section?
Sure. Yes.
Lovely. Thank you. And I'll stop the screen share.
All right. So as I mentioned, thank you everybody for your amazing timing. It's incredible that we're actually early by now 2 minutes, which is wonderful. So we asked the people that you'll hear from right now just to riff off of the topic, the themes, the ideas. Obviously we don't expect anyone to engage with all of the chapters in the book. So we're really just curious to bring in a perspective from people who have been working in one way or another around some of these conundrums and these questions in their own work, just to give us a brief starting point that would lead over into the Q&A. So it's my great pleasure to lead off first with Keller Easterling, who I mentioned earlier, is the professor of architecture here at Yale University, and as it's known to many of you, has authored Extra Statecraft, Enduring Innocence, and just most recently, Medium Design, a beautiful looking book that just came out with Verso here, and I believe a version with Strelka before. So it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Keller.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. It's an amazing book. I mean, as we've seen, enough chapters, or chapters enough to sort of sufficiently animate this congealing and metastasizing center. And I can't help but think of it as these centers as, and the things within them as some precipitates of, well, in this book, Medium Design, that I've just finished writing, trying to keep in mind some dominant habits of mind and culture, some superbugs of power that are stubborn, persistent, maybe among them the tendency to long for singular solutions and singular enemies and righteous ones and onlys and Manichaean struggles and ideational monotheism, monocultures of all sorts, ultimates, dystopias, utopias, bounded worlds, and elementary particles. So I can't help but see some of these, no matter what the morphology they may take, as if you kind of turn the sound down on the ideology, or even the technological capacity or the location, you see over and over again organizations that kind of oscillate between closed loops that want to circulate compatible information and binaries that lash out against a challenge. And of course, too, for me, it seems that what one sees are those sort of queasy, soupy centers and shiny towers of the free zone that are the engine room of capital, allowed to avoid its supposed or its theorized contradictions and allowed to kind of cocoon and bloat in, well, as Steve Graham quotes Davis and Monk as calling it the dream worlds of neoliberalism. It's also the engine room of neoliberalism, allowed to kind of create its own primordial totemic imagery. And so you're left asking, centers of what? The one thing that I kept on thinking, I would turn the page in this book and see the Lakta Center, the Gazprom Tower of, that's in St. Petersburg, except that it's not in St. Petersburg. What is it? What is it? And thinking about, I also kept thinking I might turn and see what was Astana, now Nur Sultan's Bayterek Tower, or the Abraj al-Bayt clock tower in Mecca, supposedly the center of the navel of the world now, with its shiny tower. And of course you see in that also the doubling of centers. That's this strange phenomenon that for almost all the centers that we see here, you see the double of that, the Navi Mumbai, the new Songdo city, the new Cairo city. That is a phenomenon which seems to be a cousin to your story. And what is there? It seems, I think about Vajanti Rao's discussion about it. It's an abstracted accumulation, or is it sukuks in some cases as well, abstracted financial variables. And Oleksiy Rudinsky's chilling story of how we see this come back to really primitive, again, these primitive, crude urges of the loop and the binary. And I also just wanted to underscore, Michael, your first analysis of that constant claim of decentralizing, that we see in almost every infrastructure, the advent of every infrastructure, and in almost every case, what is it tied to, whether it's Saint-Simon or hydroelectricity or railroads or Ethereum, what is it really tied to? It's really establishing a universal platform with an elementary particle. So there's a fascinating assay of that center and decentering in this book, and I congratulate you all for the assembly of it.
Thank you so much, Keller. So many things there to talk about and think about. The doubling is something which has really struck me too. I'm quite fascinated by doubles, as are many people. So let's, before we get to the discussion, let's move on to our next respondent. I'm very, very happy to have Kimberly Zarecor here. She's a professor of architecture in the College of Design at Iowa State University, as I mentioned before, and she's a scholar of architecture and urbanism in former Czechoslovakia, and has also been working a lot now on shrinking rural communities in Iowa, where she's located. And among her work, there were a couple of essays that have been particularly influential for Michal and for me as we were thinking about this project and the book. One called "What Was So Socialist About the Socialist City?" And another one is one that discusses the concept of infrastructural thinking. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Kimberly. Kimberly, are you there? I don't quite see you.
I'm here. Can you see me?
Okay, now I do. All right,
Hi.
great. Nice to see you.
It's so nice to see you. And I have connections to people on this call in so many funny ways, but Jonathan and I are very old friends from Columbia, where Keller was my teacher. And, you know, this is like return to 1999 that we get to see each other. So thank you so much. I am going to read something that I have written because then I don't get off track. So I'm just going to read it and then make some comments. So in my research about the former Czechoslovakia, I used two frameworks of analysis to reveal the specificity of the socialist city. So thank you, Jonathan, for the introduction to kind of get us to why I might be talking about this. So there are two concepts, infrastructural thinking, and then also a linked concept that I call the socialist scaffold. And these ideas are not about oppositional definitions between first and second world or east-west or capitalism and communism. Instead, what I'm trying to do is understand the varying degrees in all parts of the world and economic systems that the ideas pass through infrastructural thinking kind of circulate, but I'm really interested in why there's a certain intensity and logic within the ideology of state socialism that these seem to work best in. So in identifying these approaches, it becomes possible to differentiate the qualities of the socialist city as a subset of priorities found among all modern industrialized, technologically driven forms of urbanity. And Jennifer Robinson, who is here and I quote in my essay, speculates about the difficulties of moving beyond an individualizing approach that compares unique case studies while minimizing their commonalities. She offered to me, her work was really helpful to me to give this alternative model that focuses on finding shared units of comparison. And so this strategy has been productive to think about the specificity of the socialist city. In the simplest way, all socialist cities were modernist cities, but not all modernist cities were socialist. So to define these terms, infrastructural thinking, in my understanding, is decision making propelled by the requirements and scale of urban infrastructure. And as an approach, infrastructural thinking also requires a mechanism of implementation. And in the context of state socialism, this is what I call the socialist scaffold. It's a way to implement infrastructural thinking. It's a basic infrastructure for future growth onto which other systems, economic, social, political, environmental, can attach and become activated. This scaffold becomes material and perceptible through urban systems like tram lines, subways, highways, but also schools and theaters and museums. And it had an overarching ideological thrust that allowed a set of decisions to cohere into a recognizable strategy, which has endured beyond the political regimes of socialism. And importantly for me, this scaffold is proactive rather than a reactive approach. So the scaffold is kind of pushing forward. And it operated outside of the realm of real estate development and profit making, which had profoundly affected urban development in capitalist places. So this scaffold has a different kind of operational logic. For example, housing estates with their equitably distributed shops and services, as well as the extension of public transportation to reach them, all these big housing estates around socialist cities, these appeared in urban plans and master plans years before that there was the resources to support their construction. So they imagined them into being. This was necessary to propel the logic of the scaffold into the future. So planning and the system itself needed this kind of future-looking ideology, because if the network didn't continue to replicate itself, socialism itself loses its legitimacy, because it's this always pushing forward, always growing ideology. So today, what I want to contribute is to speculate about how the socialist scaffold is critical still into today. What I have talked about in my work is that there's a paradoxical effect that socialist city urbanism prepared these cities and their leaders to actually become model neoliberal capitalist actors at the end of Communist Party rule. So this at first seems contradictory, but if we think beyond the binaries, we see that infrastructural thinking and the socialist scaffold remain active in the layers of urban life now and provide hidden stability, even with political and institutional change. So the bureaucratic culture of communist regimes centralized decisions, elevated managers over designers, and kept the public out of debates. After 1989, a wealthy and politically powerful group of elites saw opportunities to use this existing system to control access to decision makers, to further personal interests, and continue to marginalize the public and the community. In this sense, many people who rejected communism in part for its failure to protect individual liberties have been disappointed, because state socialism turned out to be an ideal training ground for future capitalist elites to learn how to approach the city as a space of negotiation among elites with political, material, and financial capital. So therefore, I have argued that socialist urbanity, with its hierarchies of power created through control of resources and its establishment of infrastructures for future growth, made it possible for neoliberalism to re-inhabit the socialist scaffold by identifying and controlling its primary assets. In other words, the transformation of socialist cities through neoliberal strategies was not the overtaking of the old regime by Western experts who brought capitalism to a place where it did not exist, as I think is commonly believed, but rather the success of an entrenched elite who adopted this new narrative to further their own goals. So to bring this point back to the book, it seems to me that the verticality that you guys are talking about and this question of the vertical, I wonder if we could think about this as the still existing preference of those same elites who transitioned from the socialist system into a neoliberal system, and in both contexts, verticality and centrality is their preferred mode, and they are still the ones who are taking advantage of this scaffold to create a new city. But it's now a city in which those elites are in control of a different kind of, they're in a different political context, but it's this sort of the same vision. So I will leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that's great. Yes, exactly. These are the kind of things which we're really knocking around in our brain about the socialist scaffolding and infrastructural thinking. In trying to write the introduction to the book, pulling together all of these different essays. There's a lot to go on there to think about how to explain how state socialism and neoliberal capitalism are not necessarily opposites, and in many ways are parasitic and full of continuities. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Next, we have the great pleasure of having Solomon Benjamin, joining us late at night, I believe, in his time zone. Solly is, as I mentioned earlier, associate professor at the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, and he's a scholar of urbanism who has worked on this concept known as occupancy urbanism, also an influential and interesting concept relevant here, connecting also to questions of land titling, small town urbanization, and more recently, he's worked a lot on urbanism in terms of trade and transnational connections between India and China. So it's our great pleasure to have him here to give us a few comments on the topic. So I turn it over to you, Saul.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan and Michael. And I hope I'm audible, and it's good to see old friends, Jenny Robinson and all of you. I've sort of, I really enjoyed going through the book, and I've really skimmed through it. So I can't say I've sort of read it all, but I plan to do so. And I think what I found as a very interesting sort of an organizational form, it was really sort of the chapter by Owen Hatherley's discussion on the disurbanist. And the reason why that sort of anchored my thoughts today is because I kept thinking that, you know, especially like places like Chandigarh and Le Corbusier, and then variations of that in different parts of India, whether we are sometime moving between looking at individual monumental buildings versus monumental spaces of very small groups of people who are kind of moving below the radar, forming interconnected in economy and politics, especially in land. And these move across spaces, and my own interest in Shenzhen, and especially the various what we call China bazaars in various Indian cities and towns, opens up a space which I think sort of Hatherley saw as sort of urbanist, but with a kind of a political potential in everyday kind of materiality, because that's where particular kind of individualized property forms, both in land and in economy, get disrupted. I mean, it's no surprise that right now we are having with the eBay-based Omdiyar Foundation and some of India's largest policy think tanks promoting drone-based land titling in various parts of India. And this has happened because of this kind of fear of property getting disrupted, and the kind of monumental, whether we have statues, which we are now becoming famous for, huge statues of political leaders, or other kind of buildings, which we've seen below, having a kind of severe kind of, in a sense, a disruption. And therefore, I feel that on one hand, I was trained as an architect a long time ago, both in Delhi and then at MIT, whether the architectural form at one level is an analytical trap, because it gives a kind of a boundary. But on the other hand, if you look at it as a terrain, a non-cartographic terrain, whether it opens up ways to think about the city and its terrain, and this links to Jenny's work, which are uneven, unreadable, opaque, and that's how that itself becomes a kind of a political space. And that's why you would have the Omdiyar Foundation, that's the eBay Connect, with the Asia Foundation, investing along in partnership with some of India's biggest, relatively multinational corporations. I mean, the Tatas are building the Rover and other such, vehicles, investing in drone-based land titling. I mean, I come back to this because this is kind of almost the, we researched a lot on digital land titling and what that was doing for Bangalore's IT firms. But rather than seeing that as and assuming a hegemony there, what we are finding out that that's actually, they see these other more complex forms as a kind of as a very severe threat, which you can't put your finger on. And hence, I have a bit of a different take on Walter Benjamin's essays, and I'm thinking of his essays on Naples, particularly. Thinking thinking about Naples, Marseille, and Moscow as spaces which, in their porosity, also embed a kind of opaqueness which give them that kind of power. And I think that's something that I sort of see through the book. And I feel it's actually at this very interesting sort of tension point in my own sort of history of being initially trained as an architect, moving away from it, and then now again coming back in terms of to look at architecture in a non-cartographic space. It's not really urban design because that gets into a different realm, but really in terms of how one sees these complex configurations, which I think we have to take seriously. And I feel the interesting point here is that this is not just one third world kind of situation, but my own time in Toronto's, both downtown Queen Street West and York and North York. So again, breaking that boundary between the center of the city and the suburb, you look at municipal politics around land and you find not very different systems to what's happening in Bombay, Chennai, Bangalore. And this is a kind of necessarily institutionally anchored in municipal politics. But I think that's where I see this book sort of leading to interesting discussions. Yeah, so thank you a lot. I don't know, this is maybe a bit confusing, but I sort of want to sort of move beyond into these non-cartographic realms, which are necessarily invisible, and we can touch the surface, and maybe that's not a bad thing. Others will all end up as being Corbusiers, wanting to build a new town or doubling the city because the old city is a mess, and stuff like that. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, indeed. Whether architectural form is a trap or a terrain, or maybe a terrain with traps, full of non-cartographic invisibilities that we're constantly navigating our way through. That's very, very interesting and really connects to the kind of imagery that we're thinking about in the volume. So thank you so much. So our last commentator, and certainly not least, is Jennifer Robinson, professor of geography at UCL. And Jennifer's work has also been extremely influential. She is well known, of course, for her work on comparative urbanism and on the urban theory and global south. I'll just mention of all the many things that she does and is doing. She has two projects, one called Governing the Future City, which is a major ESRC funded research project along with Fulong Wu and Phil Harrison. And another project called Making Africa Urban, I believe, which is an ERC funded project. So lots of different points of intersection that branch out even further afield from where our book takes us. Our book necessarily couldn't encompass every single corner of the world we would have liked to, but it was already long enough. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Jennifer Robinson.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan and Michal. I have so valued the opportunity to read this book. It's a great introduction to a huge range of work by scholars whose work I don't normally come across, but where I find so many shared interests, concerns, questions, things to learn. So for me, from the introduction, I found it gives us a good map to what you're trying to do in the book. So you describe things like starting from zombie socialism or things that are still socialist, or the one I found quite interesting and resonant with many of the papers was a post-socialism described as a selective reappropriation. So in a sense, the past is not continuity, but again, I suppose in a Benjaminian way, it's like this and that and this and that sort of realizes itself itself in the present in an intriguing way. So we're not talking about the global East as a compass point or a very vague kind of area or terrain of post-socialism, but really thinking with a globalized form of urban socialism with many, many interconnections, and thinking from the predicament of these post-socialist or zombie socialist cities. So for me, this was really a great provocation, one I sympathize with enormously. And it struck me that the aim of doing this, so in this book, was, you said, to open up discussion about centrality in urban discourse. So this is a bold claim. It's a bigger claim. It's not just a story about post-socialism, but a story that all of us can stop and think, what is this centrality thing? And I really enjoyed Pushpa's comment just now, Pushpa Arabindu, who's a colleague of mine, and her paper beautifully exemplifies the directions in which people are pressing, thinking about the urban at the moment. And my own projects that you cited there are guilty of this as well. Fascinated by the extension of urban life, by new territories of urbanization, large scale developments all over the show, very fragmented, huge mega regions. So you ask us, snap here, let's look at the center. Let's look at the remaking of the centers of cities. And I think Pushpa gives us an important conversation there, because she's articulating new centralities that are emerging in these peripheral places. So it asks us, in a sense, to ask the Lefebvrean question, which Michal's chapter asks, which is, what are centralities of the urban? How do we configure them relationally? So I feel that you also included in the book many justifications for somebody like myself, who's mostly worked in South Africa and in other comparative projects. Why would I be interested in this book? And I think you immediately start with Vladimir Paperny's wonderful, very personal tale about the many connections that at various times his family experienced across the world. But then at certain moments of his experience of Soviet history, what he called failed attempts to get in touch with other places. And I sense this desire to open up conversations. And in a sense, the cities that you're talking about, you have many, many examples through the book. So, for example, of Owen Hatherley's stories about Moscow styling itself on a Chicago of the 1920s, and in South Africa, Johannesburg as well. Chicago was the big image for downtown Joburg's development. Or, Jonathan, your work about the double takes you can do. So it's not even as if we can trace one sort of line of connection, but actually there's a multiplicity of meanings and possible connections that come together in many of the architectural forms that you're discussing. So at one moment, a design for remaking this kind of central area in Berlin, you have the ruins of Rome, the might of Moscow, and Western skyscrapers, all those kind of double take possibilities on what this might become. And then most recently, I think it's in Clementine Cecile's paper, the designers of New York's High Line winning a competition to redesign the demolished Hotel Rossiya in Moscow area. So it's just a few examples, there's many through the book, of these kinds of connections, which suggest that we have many openings for conversations about the cities that you talk about in relation to other places. Now, the other thing that I take from it is another resonance with South Africa, which is societies of transformation. And I think this brings a very different perspective then on what we think about is going on in urban change. So this highlights a moment of transformation, as in former socialist contexts or in a post-apartheid context, is a political moment. The profound importance of political processes defining what is going on in the urban. And in your cases, very often this is a very powerful, centralized, national ability to influence processes, but also the symbolism and meaning of what is being done. In South Africa, it's very different, but politics was also important. But in fact, South Africa's urban transition was about extending rather banal, mundane urban developments to meet the demands of a new articulated political relationship between the state and citizens, which is one of service delivery now, catch up now, after all that inequality and exclusion. But the politics, I think, tells us to look at a different story, a different explanation for what is shaping the urban, and that comes out of the shared experience of transformation. So the essay, I rushed quickly to Vijayanti Rao's essay, I have to confess, although I was meant to start in Moscow, because I've always enjoyed her essays. And actually because she was talking about air rights and trading the rights to extract profit from high-rise buildings in Indian cities against delivering in housing, affordable housing. And this is so easily matches the work that I've been doing in London, which is that I would say that the explanation for the form of the urban in London is all about the money you can take out of the buildings. And Owen Hatherley and Tom Wellesley, because Owen writes a lot about London anyway, but Tom Wellesley talking about the Shard, he reminds us that actually the ability to build tall in London came from a political move, an energized political move to claim the right to build tall. But once we've got that, I would say we're having like a really mundane form of financial extraction on behalf not only of capital, but of the state. So in London, it's the planners and the state who want to extract more value from the buildings to pay for the urban development. So we come back to the politics. And for me, I think this is really a very important conclusion of the book. And it comes again and again, the sense that the state is playing a very impressive role in reshaping many different parts of the city. So, however, I would also perhaps bring up something more spatial as a final point, which is what are these centers about? And I love the way that you remake what the center of a city might be. So as I'm reading the essays, I see a lot of empty spaces, parks, horizontality. Michal's paper, which insists that the socialist centrality in some examples remade the relationship between the rest of the city and the center as an inclusive relationship. Or Jonathan, your work, which suggests that East Berlin's center was empty for huge long periods. It's just really a very interesting proposition. So we find, the need to really think again about what it is that we mean by centrality, to put it back on the agenda, to think it in a variety of different ways. And in a sense, I think your book indicates to me a zone of conceptualization that we can all be involved in urban studies, not suggesting that we have to have one theory of the center, or we must all look at the center, or the center's in the center. Centrality might be on a stretched periphery. So we have such a diversity of experiences of the urban to explore together. But I think you've shown how we can have a good conversation across different lines of connection, either because we already are connected, we've got lots of shared elements of our cities, or because in our conversations we can have some emergent understandings or provocations which find us some interlocutors. So these kinds of concepts then are rather more Benjaminian. So drawing extremes together, reaching the limits of concepts, or having a new kind of concept or idea flash up in a different constellation across diverse urban experiences. So I think for me, this is really a great pleasure to read the book, and thank you for doing it. I hope that others will go forth and read many chapters. Thanks.
Thank you. That was a real tour de force overview of an engagement with so many of the issues that come up with the book. Thank you. I'm processing it all as you went through it. Thinking very much just about your last point about emptiness, and one of the things I was toying with for my 1-minute presentation, but then decided not to go that direction, which was to try to think about the distinction between emptiness and absence, which may not exactly be the same thing, although they can also refer to the same geographic space. So thank you very, very, very much for all these wonderful and exciting ideas about how to think through the topics. So I also wanted to mention, since you mentioned Vijayanti, that one of the reasons why Vijayanti can't join us, and I believe is probably the case for Steve Graham as well, is today happens to be the 1-year anniversary of the death of Michael Sorkin. And since this is a community with many urbanists, I'm sure many of you know who he is, and a really untimely death due to COVID. And his memorial, in fact, which I didn't realize, was today. So that's why Vajayanti was unable to be here. She worked, of course, very closely with him. Speaking of emptiness and absence. So I think on that somewhat somber note, I want to move us now into the question and answer period, or open discussion, however we would like to think about it. Zoom has this very strange facet that if you are a panelist, apparently you cannot pose a question in the Q&A. You can only see questions that the audience, the attendees pose there. So we do have a few questions that have come through the chat from panelists to panelists. And I don't currently see any open questions in the Q&A. So audience members, attendees, if you have any comments or questions, please put them into the Q&A. And then we will do our best to get the overview of them all. But I do see one question from Pushpa. Michal, shall we start with that?
Yeah, let's start with Pushpa's question, and then there's a question from Abdul Kutub to the, well, I think to all of us. So maybe Pushpa's, although Pushpa's, I think, left us, but I think it was a good question.
I'm here.
Sorry. Oh,
Sorry.
you're here. Great.
I'm still here. Oh, I was just, it was just a question for the people working on Moscow who were reinforcing its centrality as an architect planner. I had come across the Plan Oblast many years ago, almost a decade ago, which was about regionalizing, and it echoes which many cities tend to tell, at least through the planning jargon, that it's an attempt at decentering the city. And Moscow, the winning scheme was, I think, even described as a city of forests. So I was just wondering, and I cannot find any update on that plan. So it was a very temporal moment of regionalization, and I wondered what happened to it, and people working on Moscow, if they could give a update on it. It was a very planning practice oriented question, just out of personal interest.
Be a good question for Dasha Paramonova to answer in particular if she was here, but maybe Clem or Vladimir have some thoughts, or Andreas.
Unfortunately,
my
I
connection
don't
is
have
really
the
bad.
answers. Sorry.
I don't know, but can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you fine. It's the Norfolk internet.
Okay. It's terrible. Sorry about this. But all I know, I'm sorry, I don't have a full answer for you, but that the attempt to create a parliament in the newly formed Moscow Oblast, which was given its own status, you're right, didn't work because it was too far from the Kremlin, ironically. So it just reinforced the centrality of the Kremlin in the end. But I don't know exactly the status of that plan right now.
And the only thing that I would say, well, this is the Moscow Oblast plan. I think, I mean, ideologically, this part. I mean, I'm looking at this partly in the book that I'm trying to write now about architecture and politics in Moscow in the decade that's just finished. And there is a kind of ideological tendency towards an overemphasis or an emphasis, a really kind of elaborately placed emphasis on decentralization and peripheralization of the city. One of the Moscow urban forums, which is this big kind of conference that brings together urbanists and decision makers annually, was called Archaeology of the Periphery. And it was all about turning Moscow into a periphery, and precisely in a disurbanist or kind of post-disurbanist vein, dissolving this distinction between city and country. And Park Zaryadye, the park that was designed by Dileska Fidio Renfro, which is the focus of my research project actually, on the site of Hotel Rassia, is framed as this kind of wild space, a wild urbanist space by the architects, which is neither city nor country, neither winter nor summer, kind of a post dialectical space. So there is this rhetorical premium being placed in Moscow on foresting and wilding the city, which is and peripheralizing the city, which I think, as Clem showed, and as Dasha's chapter shows too, is the rhetoric is often very much at odds with the reality of the project. And it's funny that, just briefly mentioned to finish that answer, that with the official ideological concept behind Park Zaryadia as formulated by Dulesca-Fidio was wild urbanism, as translated into the direct translation into Russian would be Diki Kapitalism. Diki Urbanism. And that was initially what the translation was. That was the translation that was rendered. But pretty soon in the PR documentation connected to the project, they started calling it Prirodny Urbanism, which means natural urbanism, precisely for the reason that Diki Kapitalism sounded too much like wild capitalism. So anyway, there is an ideological premium placed on wildness in Moscow today, and not just Moscow, I think.
Shall we read out Abdul Kutub's question? Oops, you're muted.
Because the trains are going past, so I keep muting myself. How or when do we get away from this Cold War neoliberal framework of neither Washington nor Moscow, which equates state socialism and the imperialists of the West, which is today extended to neither Washington nor Beijing? That's a big question from Abdul. Anyone want to give it a go? And I don't know, Abdul, if you're still there, you can actually turn your microphone on if you want to. I can turn your microphone on. Let me know if you want me to do that. But in a way, are you talking about the fact that we're sort of stuck within a Cold War framework in this conversation? Because we're trying to get away from it. That's kind of one of the things that we're trying to do.
Right. I was also wondering about that with the phrasing of the question, whether we're stuck in neither Washington nor Moscow, or is it Washington? I don't know, both Washington and Moscow, or Washington, Moscow, and everything else, or?
Abdul's here now, so he can elaborate.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think especially in us as people living in the West, we are fed all this propaganda about Moscow and Beijing being these evil countries, right? Whatever. But I think also taking this. Like stepping back and saying, "Oh, we don't support either," I think is, I think also is still misguided, right? And I think it doesn't, it's not really fruitful. I think because there is a difference, right? There's a difference that because Moscow and Beijing have been, at least even within their, with all their faults, are a better alternative to Washington, right? So I think, especially and given that, I think us, especially living in the West, I think it's important for us to emphasize how Beijing and Moscow were better alternatives, right? Not that they're without faults, but I think it's important to acknowledge that, at least in the way we speak academically or in media.
But do you mean in terms of urban planning or architecture or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean both politically and in those sense, right? Because I mean, the term, like the concept of the social condenser, comes out of Moscow, right? And even today in Beijing, I mean, you hear a lot about these like people doing like urban interventions, stuff like that, that are really, really interesting, that wouldn't be possible in the States, right? I live in Washington myself, so like it's a lot of the stuff is like really unthinkable here. So
Patrick, you wanted to jump in on that?
Mm-hmm. I would like to chip in on this kind of binary: Moscow, Washington, Beijing, Washington. You know, we have all this work now: Oscar Sanchez Sibones, Red Globalization, Capitalism's Fellow Traveler, other work. Actually, in the 1970s, a lot of scholars were already talking about the convergence between the Soviet bloc and the capitalist bloc. So once we move away from this binary, and maybe my zones are a case that lend them to that, but if you think about all this kind of ideas of non-alignment, yeah, what we sometimes celebrate, or this decoloniality, yeah, when I look at like the peak moment of this new international economic order, then I once counted 27 of the 77 nations that wanted the new international economic order had special economic zones, yeah. Indonesia was already like the place where 500,000 communists or alleged communists had been butchered in '65. So I think we need to be quite careful with the kind of spatiality and territoriality of these ideas, and also with the kind of fake ethnicities that capitalism puts in our heads. Yeah, in the end, it's really, I'm sorry to say, I'm still stuck in the Cold War because it still goes on. Yeah, the Cold War was just a war on the workers of the world, and it goes on until today. Yeah, and that's the war we need to fight.
Yeah, and in a way, I suppose also there is more to the Cold War than just Moscow and Beijing, Washington too, and etc. Because the Cold War, in its hottest and most lived and intense and murderous and violent reality, was fought and won and lost and suffered in all of those places that aren't Moscow or Beijing or Washington. So I suppose it's in a way possible to. The fact that the Cold War conversation is reduced by a binary one is the problem. There's a question from Jennifer. So Jennifer, do you want to ask it, or shall I read it out?
I can ask it, sure. I was just interested because I think a lot of the papers I read, maybe just my selection, were focused on quite institutional processes, design, the kind of power relations. And then Tom Wellesley had this great kind of more artistic kind of paper in which he positioned the Shard, this tall pyramid type building in London, from many different perspectives. You want to bring the building down to size. I'm encountering the building. And so for me, that was an interesting thing that, if buildings are built with a banal financialization or a banal kind of value extraction, where's the meaning? I mean, I would say that most tall buildings in London are built with no meaning whatsoever. So we produce that meaning then in this everyday way. And I just wondered whether there's other kinds of stories that might emerge out of the studies that people have done on the different cities in the book, which speak to that. Are there counter stories? Are there oppositional stories? Irreverent, I'm sure, kind of stories about buildings, yeah.
Michal, the palace in Warsaw would seem to be a good counter story to the Shard.
Yeah, I mean, the palace in Warsaw is an extraordinary Stalinist skyscraper, which was the symbol and the material manifestation of Stalinist oppression of Poland, but at the same time was the place where, if you wanted to buy a book, if you wanted to buy a Western academic journal or a copy of Vogue or somewhere in the 1980s or 1970s, you'd go to the Palace of Culture. When the Rolling Stones played in Poland, when Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis played in Warsaw, they played in the same Congress hall where the Communist Party congresses were held. So it was simultaneously the most dramatic place of kind of linear ideological oppression, but also the place of austerity and contestation of that. And I suppose the same is true. Actually, Owen's book on plazas shows this, that these central plazas of cities are places of contestation always. And as I suppose, as we saw in January in Washington, DC, that contestation isn't always a very nice one or a very progressive one. But there must be, yeah, I'm sure there are myriad examples of that. That would be a wonderful comparative project to kind of a framing for a comparative project. I don't know if anyone else can think of one. That's a great question by Pushpa. Has the Gazprom tower generated any counter politics? Yes, it has. There's a great video by, I don't know if some of you, Vladimir or Clem, you've probably seen this. Alexei certainly has. The Singspiel by Что делать, about the Gazprom tower. It's a mini opera that Что делать did in 2012, dramatizing the debates around the construction of the Gazprom tower. It's a brilliant piece of work. I'll put the link into the chat. Yeah.
Just jumping back to Jennifer's question about meaning in these buildings. I mean, one of the points of tension with the reproduction of tall buildings and skyscrapers is that you have a doubling, tripling replication of the building, which is supposed to, at some sense, be the center, into a forest grove. So if you think about something like Bruno Taut's idea of the city crown, the Stadtkrone, where the idea is that you have a talismanic building, a cathedral, effectively, that is reflects his words, the ultimate, which he said was quiet and empty, kind of a sacred space in the center of the city. Something like the Palace of Culture in Warsaw, or some of the other, the Empire State Building at its in the very early days, when there's one major tall building in the city, it does take that cathedral-like role and has a different kind of meaning. The question then is, what happens when that starts to be replicated? What happens when you have multiple tall buildings that that stop fulfilling these kind of meaning-imbibing roles? And then you have one that kind of breaks away from the pack, arguably the Shard, right, in a different location than the other ones in the city, which then starts to try to pull back that central spiritual power to itself, but is in a completely different position vis-a-vis the whole unfolding of the urban space. So I think there's some kind of analysis about these competing sacrednesses of these tall talismanic phallic symbols that are in tension between the kind of the original idea of building so tall and this idea of replicating that continuously in various ways.
Thanks very much. Vladimir just said he had to leave. I had while we're waiting for other questions, I had two pointed questions. I mean, I have millions of questions to everything everybody said, but I wanted to quickly ask a point of clarification or elaboration to Khadija and Jonas, and also to Alexei. For Alexei, if he's with us, has the freeing of Oleg Sentsov has it changed anything? Has it changed the substance of your argument, or has it not? And for Khadija and Jonas, I think I already intimated the question earlier on. What does this declaration 3 days ago or 2 days ago by the Humboldt Forum that they will return, or that they plan to return, the Benin bronzes to Nigeria signify? Does it mean anything? It's like Oxford University, whichever college it was, Oriel or something, saying that they plan to take down this statue in the future. They haven't done anything; it's still there. But is that any different to that, or is it actually a substantive, meaningful process?
I mean, we can go a second. Just waiting if your first question.
Oh, it's not working. Oh,
it's working. Khadija, shall we jump in now, or is okay? Go ahead.
Yeah, because I think I'm jumping in and out, so I'm not sure.
I was so busy trying to fix my microphone, I wasn't even listening. But the repatriation of the bronzes. I hear myself in echo, sorry. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I mean, it's just one of the many political kind of leveragings of repatriation, which, I'm working on in more detail. I don't think it actually completely changes the argument at all. I think they're just making another instrumental gesture, which will, of course, does put pressure on England and other countries to do the same. But and Berlin is trying to kind of make themselves central and yeah, by leading the repatriation of the burning bronzes. But what, Jonas, you were saying something earlier today as well.
Well, I mean, I think one needs to give a bit of a backdrop, you know. So about, you know, a decade ago or so, there was no discussion about the return of either remaining skeletons in the Cultural Heritage Foundation's depots or the Benin bronzes, which in fact were meant to be the large sort of opening you know, items that would draw visitors. In fact, speaking of sort of, you know, palaces in the center of town, I mean, it's very interesting that they are, of course, also conceived of as tourist traps, quite literally. I remember a very early visit through the architectural skeleton of the new Humboldt Forum, and the personal advisor to Neil McGregor back then was basically telling us that they had miscalculated the visitor flows. So they have, you know, a staircase and an elevator on one side, and they were trying to attract people to actually walk up the stairs instead of taking the elevator. And he was talking about which major ethnological object to place on the top of the stairs so that people would actually walk up the stairs instead of taking the elevator.
Yeah, it's milk in the supermarket kind of stuff.
That gives you a bit of a sense of the appreciation of, you know, the depth of these objects on the one hand. The other thing, the argument that we're trying to make in this chapter, I forgot the exact title because, like Patrick was intimating, you know, time is, you know, relative in these days. We were trying to argue that essentially what the Humboldt Forum is trying to do is it's trying to portray a kind of horizontalism through this new central place. So the whole argument was that the whole world could be seen within the Humboldt Forum. And what it was doing at the time was propagating, you know, these terms of shared heritage, for instance, you know, arguing that what we could do is we could lend these things back and we could all own them together because it's world heritage. And after all, now they're here, but you don't have museums, we have one. So, you know, why don't we just keep them here and you can come and visit it and we'll establish some, you know, short-term project based sort of collaborations. Of course, the attempt of talking about restitution is just another way of faking this horizontalism, because in the end, this move right now,
it's just going to be a loan. It's not going to be actually returned. Like they're not going to actually reverse the property ownership. They're just going to, and that's the important key problem, really. This, so these things are kind of, yeah, gesturally decentered and then quickly recentered.
And one of the reasons why we featured these, I mean, the person who was actually throwing a journalist onto the judoka mat was actually the president of, you know, Prussia's Cultural Heritage Foundation, who likes to portray himself as a black belt judoka. And in this same interview talks about how he's often compared to Indiana Jones and how he discovered a Siberian, you know, golden grail somewhere, etc. And now we see the, you know, the cultural, sort of the director of the cultural segment of the German Foreign Office going to Nigeria and portraying himself as a, you know, as a sort of leader of the free world in some way, that he's making this progressive statement. And we're finally projecting these things back. And
Stuttgart did the same, giving back the Witboy Bible and whip, and then makes a big sort of city campaign out of looking very good, but does it in such a rushed manner that no one there is ready to receive it. And, you know, and the whole repatriation object goes on a kind of tour around the country that really just advertises Germany in Namibia and doesn't do anyone any good. There's all sorts of horizontal kind of violence that goes on then there between communities. And yeah, it's highly problematic and politicized, really.
I can maybe jump in there for one.
Rigorous becoming assessment.
Yeah,
well, it's late on a Friday night, we're being honest, you know.
Jump in for 1 second on that. There's so much more to say in that, and it leads to a slightly different direction, but just the thinking back to these discussions about absence and emptiness, one of the themes that's been talked about is the returning, which has not yet obviously happened, of the Benin bronzes, is the role of leere Plätze, of empty spaces in the museum. And we're thinking now about them not as something which is a negative, but as a positive, like to be proud of that empty space in the museum as something to show off in a particular way. And I think that's a sort of a small but interesting connection to this larger question of presence and absence and emptiness and fullness within the space. But it also, of course, points to the geopolitics of the situation, as Khadija was just mentioning, that in many ways, Germany is now positioning itself as ahead of France and the UK, especially in thinking about Dan Hicks' book, which just came out, really excoriating the UK for its approach. And this is, there's definitely a politics in that, whether or not the pieces actually end up getting returned or not, because of course the council of the Prussian Cultural Foundation, the Stiftungsrat, still needs to approve this, which has not yet happened. So,
of course, the return of objects is one thing. You know, the new relations that are being established to actually Afro-descendant communities in these respective countries is the much bigger task. I mean, that is really what is being called for. You know, the restitution of dignity is essentially at stake. That's one thing. But what I wanted to add, just as a concluding thing, the reason I've been having this, the Palace of Culture of the Palace of the Republic hovering in my back with these letters, I think actually mirrored in the wrong way. It's a bit of an
it's right, Zweifel.
It says Zweifel, which is the German word for doubt, and that was an installation by the Norwegian artist Lars Ramberg, who installed these huge letters on top of the about to be dismantled Palace of the Republic. And I think that's really, for me, the much more interesting metaphor that is at stake. This interim period in which the formerly socialist palace was still present was, an indicator of doubt, of an unsure direction. And I think a lot of the recentering that you're talking about is essentially what Nanette Snoop, the director of the Rautenstrauch-Jost Museum in Cologne, called out when she said that this whole debate is about, male fragility. That's what I like about this very honest installation. It is saying this is a very doubtful period and people are really unsure what to do, including the cultural politicians making these moves. I think that this Leerstelle, this empty space, this doubt, it should be much more central than this fake certainty.
I just wanted to say one thing with regard to, and I've got loads more reflections to add on this conversation, but with regards to what Jennifer was saying about Johannesburg and the debate now about, I've been asking this question and I've been struggling to find answers. Maybe I've been looking in the wrong places or looking in the wrong way, but with regards to the debate about what's going to happen to downtowns and CBDs post-COVID. And I remember my only visit to downtown Johannesburg and walking around this post office scape that had been, there were still people working in those Miesian tower blocks, but not that many people were still working in them. And it was a kind of eviscerated downtown that was still living its own type of life. But do we have any, does anybody here, Jennifer, do you have any predictions as to whether there is going to be a Johannesburgization of all downtowns everywhere, or what's going to happen?
Well, that would be a very exciting proposition, because in fact, a lot of those office buildings are filled with a huge number of micro enterprises. So they've been transformed from medical offices or whatever into transnational traders, so Ethiopian traders, people from Zimbabwe, right. Real packed together. Some great work by a colleague from Joburg called Tanya Zack, Z-A-C-K, documenting some of that. So the downtown is very big in Joburg, actually, so it's very varied. Yeah. So sometimes it's really, you can drive through at night and some places are scarily empty. But it's been reoccupied for all sorts of different reasons, including a reoccupation of the residential areas by a whole new cohort of people, including a whole pile of hijacked buildings, which have then been transformed and regenerated in some ways. It's a very diverse story. So I don't know what will happen. And I suppose one of the thoughts that I had as I was reading the book was that a lot of central areas in very big, poor cities are already, they're kind of evacuated because people they don't perform a centrality, perhaps because people don't generally reach them. So this would even be the story of the sort of multi-centered US city in the mid-20th century. As a certain areas stop forming a centrality for the whole city, but become all sorts of micro-centralities, or again, localized centers. So I think the fate of Johannesburg's downtown is very very diverse. And I think it also suggests something about what you're talking about, is that the centralities are, you know, complex, reproduced, contested, performing many different functions in the city. Yeah, so that would be an interesting conversation for sure.
See, yeah, Le Repleta, as Jonas writes, and there's a whole, Dacia Zanowska has a wonderful project at Oxford that's just started an examination of this empty spaces after socialism, which has also taken on kind of more relevance or urgency, perhaps, in our current predicament. There's another question.
So if there is there, yes, so we're at 3 p.m., which is when we were going to end the formal part of this. And if there is another burning question, we certainly can do it. I think at that point, then we should end the recording. I did have one quick thought based on just what Michal was talking about with Jennifer right now about the downtowns, which is, I wonder, and this is not a question to be answered right here, I'm just asking it in a very rhetorical fashion. How will the empty office buildings be reappropriated post-pandemic when the workers don't come back? Right? I mean, I don't think that they will remain fully empty, but they will be used in probably ways that we have not yet completely anticipated. So one thought, you know, for the few times that I do get to wander around Midtown Manhattan and think about its ghostly present and future. So was there another question, or have we reached the point where we can close off the public portion of it? Michal, anybody else? Anybody want to jump in, speak now?
Or if anybody does have any predictions about Jonathan's questions, because it's so important. And my partner works in a law firm in the city, and she's always getting mixed messages from her bosses about whether they're going to have to go back into work or not. And it's extraordinary. And so many businesses around in places like Shoreditch or in Tower Hamlets that are city dependent, like my local dry cleaner in Hoxton has closed down because 90%, even though it's in a residential neighborhood, it's a kilometer away from the city. So 90% of his business was doing suits for city workers. So this must be happening all over the place, but we're not observing it because we're sitting in our houses. And then all of these buildings are just empty. So where are the anarchists? You know, where are the people? Where are the bomb and whatever tools anarchists use to occupy buildings? Why aren't we seizing these places? Because Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak aren't going to do it for us.
Or is somebody already seizing these places and we just don't know about it?
Yeah, various sovereign wealth funds or God knows what. So has anyone got any answers? Well, to Tom, is the Shard very empty now? We don't know because we're sitting at home.
I mean, maybe an anecdote from the British provinces. Yeah, I live in Bournemouth, which is like a seaside town. We have quite a lot of second home owners from London, you know, and what was amazing and shocking at Christmas was that they all came here, you know, like when Johnson announced the lockdown, he gave them like 3-4 hours to run away from London. They all came here, and the queues at the butchers for Christmas, you know, they were like hundreds of meters down the road. And at the same time, I was thinking, yeah, all these people will have placed another order with a butcher in London. And what is that butcher doing now with all the Christmas turkeys or something? And at the same time, we have quite a few, you know, Debenhams and things like that that went bust in recent times. They are all being turned into posh penthouses now. So there's actually a property market emerging here, which is maybe really moving towards the kind of less high density population spaces. And I think this is something also that tells us something about the center in a time of pandemic, you know, like when it's really about the aerosols, then the center isn't the nicest place to be.
At the same time, though, if you think about the role, say, of the US Capitol after the storming, the symbolic center is increasingly visible even as the lived center is being distributed in the ways that Patrick was just explaining.
I still see lots of people who I suspect have something interesting to say in the audience and in the panel. So if there's any final words or prognoses or statements or poems or any other kinds of delivery, songs to be sung, then please sing.
Well, a suggestion maybe from Jennifer that we can start well, she's not quite suggesting, this is my take on it, that Occupy Empty Buildings movement.
Yeah, let's do it. This is the beginning of it, perhaps.
Yeah, but my second comment was that most likely in London, they'll simply convert them into the usual unaffordable housing if we continue with the kind of globalized investment circuits. So I don't know, we could just find a different use coming forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think because the thing is, most of these offices are being leased they're being leased by corporate firms. They're being subleased effectively via building management organizations who lease it from the owner of the building. And so the people, once they're, I don't know how long their tenancy agreements are, but they're going to run out and not re-sign them. So whoever is the freeholder of the building is going to be the one who's going to be making those decisions.
So it's a space to watch.
Yes, watch this space, the famous advertisement. So maybe that's a good point at which to end this.